Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's incredible team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning services that are customized to the pharmacy professional. You can learn more and book a free discovery call at yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. All right, Tim, this week's question comes from Paul, who asks, I've been maxing out my HSA for a few years and plan to continue to do so until the day comes that I'm no longer allowed to contribute to it. So far, I have not used any of this money and plan to leave it invested for the foreseeable future as well, and then start using it in retirement to fund healthcare costs. I intend to become an expat when I retire, which will likely happen well before my 60s. So Paul currently is 34. Are there any considerations or potential barriers to accessing or using HSA money when living outside of the United States? Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so just to recap, the HSA is that account that has a triple tax benefit. So it goes in pre-tax, it grows tax-free, like an IRA or a 401k, and then you can distribute it, today or sometime in the future for qualified medical expenses or once you reach age 65. One of the things I will say to call out is that if you do use it for non-medical expenses at age 65 or beyond, you still have to pay like income tax. So it goes back to more of a double tax instead of the triple tax. You get the true triple tax benefit if you're using it for healthcare expenses, which people typically as they age are going to use it for that. But I think, this is an interesting question, Tim. And again, not one that's been asked before. For you to contribute to an HSA, you have to be in a high deductible health plan. So if you're living as an expat, that might not be the case. Really, the limitations of using the HSA really comes down to, is the medication that you're purchasing or the procedure that you're paying for, is it legal in the US and is it legal in the country in which you're residing? If those are both true, then you can use HSA money for that. So it has to be legally prescribed and legally purchased. I think the other thing that would just be a consideration here from the HSA perspective is that same thing with the 401k and IRAs, not all of them are created equal, right? So some HSAs, you can invest the first dollar. Some, you need $1,000, then you can invest anything above that. Some HSAs will issue like a debit card for you to access your funds. So if you're doing that in another country, so if you travel abroad, and I remember this when I first, backpack Europe back in the day, I would be charged lots of fees, like foreign transaction fees or conversion fees or some type of markup if I was using it abroad. So the same thing, happens potentially with an HSA is that if you're using that, these fees can range anywhere from 1%, 2%, 3% or even more. So I think that's the other thing that you have to kind of factor in is like, yeah, of course it'd be great to use this money that's kind of sheltered from tax for health expenses, but you have to factor in, again, is it legally prescribed? Is it legal in both countries? And then the fact of like the foreign transaction fees and the like. The one thing, depending on where you're at in the world, it could be cheaper to pay for a procedure or a medication out of pocket. So using after-tax dollars in that country's currency. So that's just part of the assessment. But, I think if Paul's asking like, hey, are these funds, shut off for me and I can't access them? The answer is no. But, it does come with caveats in terms of like, does it make sense, in terms of the fees? Is it allowable in terms of, what the laws of the country are that you're residing in and the US at that time? So again, still a super powerful account in terms of, being able to shelter tax, but you just have to make sure everything lines up.
Paul, great question. And for those that are looking for more of a primer on the HSA and some of the nuances of how to optimize that strategy, we'll point you to episode 165. We talked about the power of an HSA as well as a blog post about how to really maximize that as more of a long-term savings vehicle versus more of a pass-through for healthcare expenses in the moment, which certainly both of those strategies may be appropriate. So we'll link to both the podcast and the blog post in the show notes. Tim Baker, one of the questions I often get, and I think maybe Paul's referring to this a little bit here, is, if I have healthcare expenses that are now and I cash flow and pay for those, and then I record those expenses, but I don't use my HSA funds in the moment, is that something we can reimburse ourselves at a later point? And then, thoughts that you have on how to sort of keep track of all of that to be able to do that well.
I think as long as it's within the same tax year, I think you're good, because obviously you have to record that. It might be where you go back and amend a tax return, but there is flexibility in terms of how those dollars flow on the back end. Obviously, the major restriction, Tim, is on the contribution end. So you have to make sure that it's married to a high deductible health plan, but you do have a little bit of wiggle room on the back end in terms of contribution. I would just be wary of kind of bleeding over year, and if you show a receipt for a procedure from 2019, but then that you are actually reporting that on your 2021 taxes, that's where the IRS might ask questions, and at the end of the day, you have to feel comfortable about what's on that tax return, and some of these things could open you up for audit. So you just got to be, it's always good to keep your receipts and have a good system of tracking that. Obviously, we talk about tax a lot on this. We have a tax team that does this for clients. So working with a professional to kind of guide you with some of those questions, I think is going to be important too.
And shout out to our tax planning team that makes so much of the value that we're able to offer our clients at YFP Planning, as well as the community at large that are looking for optimizing their tax situation. For those that want more information on the services that we offer at YFP Tax, you can visit yfptax.com. Paul, thanks again for taking time to submit the question. As a small thank you, we're going to be sending you a super comfy YFP t-shirt. And for those that are listening, we'd like to feature your question on an upcoming episode. You can either send us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can record your question by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask-YFP. As we wrap up this week's Ask a YFP CFP segment of the podcast, an important reminder that the content that we provide is for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your week.